Throughout history, the United States has participated in many wars. By intervening in these wars, there were many negative impacts and after effects, such as debt, mental health loss, casualties, and many other negative outcomes. Interventionism is a mistake the U.S. has made far too many times, such as in World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, and Afghanistan War.
World War II is one of the only wars in the United States history where there is a good mix of people who did and did not want to be involved in the war. Most of the non-intervention options that existed in the United States were after World War I and before World War II. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum said 20 years after World War I ended, 70% of Americans polled believed that American participation in the war had been a mistake. These feelings of non-intervention stayed for some people during the entire war as well. The United States took many steps after World War I to return to isolationism and stay neutral after the first attack that happened in Poland. Americans were so against joining another war that they did not care who won the war in Europe as long as they were not involved in it. Americans who polled immediately after the war overwhelmingly hoped for the defeat of Germany, but more than 90% opposed getting involved in the war. A majority did not want to join the fight even if Nazi Germany defeated Great Britain and France. There were more reasons than just regret from joining World War I that kept many Americans from wanting to join the Second World War, and a specific one that the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum gives is mothers who did not wish to send their sons to war, Americans of German or Italian descent, Americans of Irish descent, who opposed helping Great Britain, socialists, students, pacifists, and a host of prominent businessmen and intellectuals and average citizens took action to prevent the United States intervention. As war progressed, more and more Americans started to change their opinions on joining the war and aiding Great Britain in it as well, especially after Pearl Harbor. Yet it was ultimately an attack by Japan and Axis power like Nazi Germany that ended Americans' debate about whether to intervene in the war. The opinion of interventionism only grew stronger as the war progressed. Only days after the United States entered World War II, no mainstream isolationist movement remained.
The horrors of the Second World War are etched into the imagination of public discourse. But what of its aftermath? How does a continent at war for 6 years and unstable for much longer create peace when so many national, ideological, and social resentments remain? It's easy to forget that a military victory for the Allies didn't mean that a defeated people's attitudes and ideologies suddenly changed.
Once the war ended, some opinions started to change back to the non-interventionism and about how the United States should not have entered the war. It was the aftermath of the war and how other countries still suffered that started to change their opinions. Jacob G. Hornberg, a professor from the University of Dallas, argued, while victory in the war did in fact free the Poles from Nazi tyranny, it also left them under the control of the communist regime of the Soviet Union for the next 45 years. From the standpoint of the Poles, there was no difference between Nazi tyranny and the communist tyranny, which is why they never celebrated World War II as a victory. After World War II was when the United States adopted the national security state, which is something Russia, Cuba, Egypt, and North Korea's government go by. It is characterized by a massive, permanent, generously funded military establishment, a highly secret intelligence agency with ominous powers including assassination, and a massive surveillance operation to secretly monitor and keep track of both citizens and foreigners. Hornberg stated that to get the national security state to pass, President Truman had to scare the Americans into thinking that Russia could attack them at any minute. Truman told Americans that this kind of government was needed to protect the United States from Russia, but this was one of the steps that ended up leading America into another war. President Truman and the other U.S. officials told Americans that it was necessary to adopt this totalitarian-like governmental structure in order to prevent America's World War II partner and ally, the Soviet Union, from conquering the United States in what became known as the Cold War.
The United States intervening in World War I was a mistake. One reason was the suppression of free speech of the American people as a result of entering the war effort in Europe. This was one of the most important eras of the 20th century in terms of people's rights. In American history, during times of war, free speech often becomes less important to things such as patriotism. As a result of this, a few particularly important laws were passed. David Hudson states, Congress became concerned with internal dissent, particularly with those whom they suspected of sympathizing with the Germans and the Russians. It passed the Espionage Act of 1917, which has been described as an overt assault upon First Amendment freedoms. This law criminalized attempting to cause insubordination to the war effort, willfully attempting to cause insurrection, and obstructing the recruiting or enlistment of potential volunteers. This was the first law passed of this kind. Congress soon after passed an amendment to it called the Sedition Act of 1918, which further infringed on First Amendment freedoms. The law prohibited urging any curtailment of the war with intent to hinder its prosecution, advocating, teaching, defending, or acts supporting or favoring the cause of any country at war with the United States, or opposing the cause of the United States. Another reason the U.S. should not have intervened in Europe during World War I is the fact that the U.S. fought for the wrong reasons. If someone were to ask the American public why they thought the U.S. went to fight in Europe, most would say the sinking of the Lusitania or the Zimmerman telegram. Few people would say it was because of American loans in Europe. While the Lusitania and Zimmerman, among other factors, contributed, this, in fact, was the larger contributing factor to intervention. The U.S. had a vested financial interest in the outcome of the war in Europe. American businesses and banks made huge loans to the Allies. If they didn't win, then they were unlikely to get their money back. This is not a suitable explanation to the 116,000 dead Americans that fought in Europe, who died for the interests of American businesses and banks.
Intervening in Vietnam caused many casualties, health effects, and dangers to the U.S. due to health effects, and should have never been intervened. David Flores, who studied at the University of Michigan receiving a PhD in sociology, argues about why interventionism was a bad idea. Flores argues that the casualties in Vietnam were accumulating rapidly, and communities began to feel the emotional impact of war, questioning the political justifications for staying at war in Vietnam. This piece of evidence shows how the war was a mistake to join because everyone was questioning the justifiability due to the severe negative emotional impact the war was having and increasing casualties. Flores argues about how guerrilla warfare in southern Vietnam's companions caused mental harm to the soldiers. Flores quotes the stress of a Vietnam veteran named Sam. I made a decision. I won't give any of them a chance, and that I would just kill every one of them that I got, and that I was going to get them back for what they did to us. If they are Vietnamese, they are my enemy. This quote effectively goes into the mind of a Vietnam soldier, showing how their mental health was deteriorating due to fighting in Vietnam. The soldier wanted to kill every single Vietnam they came across, which screams mental trauma, further proving that Vietnam was a bad idea in joining. Flores argues how personal experiences of soldiers in Vietnam War were traumatic, which could have been prevented if the U.S. didn't intervene. Flores quotes a Vietnam War veteran named Freddie who had witnessed 2 of his friends dying to save him. We were being used as bait. The war was fought by body count. I got shot dead smack in the stomach. Danny crawled over first, and Michael second, and tried to stop the bleeding. And then Danny got killed on top of me, and Michael came next. This veteran describes something that happened one day in Vietnam that made the Vietnam War mentally traumatic. Freddie would not have had to witness all this trauma if the U.S. had never intervened in the Vietnam War. Alexander C. McFarlane is the director of the University of Adelaide Center for Traumatic Stress Studies with over 250 articles on the effects of PTSD and other mental disorders. McFarlane argues that the Vietnam War created mental health issues that could have been prevented if the U.S. did not join the war. McFarlane states that the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study showed the psychological costs of war, with 18.7% of veterans having a lifetime history of PTSD due to participating in Vietnam. Other costs due to traumatic war stress include increased risk for depression, personality disorders, suicide, and alcohol abuse. This evidence supports the idea that intervening in the Vietnam War had a severe mental health impacts on many Vietnam veterans, which could have been avoided if we had never intervened in the first place. McFarlane argues how mental health contributes to emotions of revenge. Furthermore, terrorist mindsets, created in part thanks to intervening in the Vietnam War. McFarlane explains that these psychological costs can lead to nations seeking revenge. Effects of violence have become of particular concern with the current conflicts in the Middle East and the associated terrorist movements that seek to lure young men and women to their violent cause. There are some groups inside and outside of the U.S. that want to cause terrorist attacks on the U.S., thanks to our intervention, which we shouldn't have done. Intervening in the Vietnam War has caused many casualties, health effects, and dangers to the U.S. which should have never been intervened.
The United States war in Afghanistan is a part of history that will echo through time as a tool to learn from. To the general public, the aim was to dismantle al-Qaeda and deny a base of operation in Afghanistan by removing the Taliban. As many will know, this was in spite of 9/11. During the start of the war between the U.S. and Afghanistan, many were on the side of the U.S., standing up and showing that the United States is a superpower and not to be provoked. Years later, the Washington Post revealed a confidential trove of government documents revealing that senior U.S. officials failed to tell the truth about the war in Afghanistan throughout the 18-year campaign, making rosy pronouncements that they knew to be false and hiding unmistakable evidence the war had become unwinnable. Steve Martinot has written multiple different scholarly articles circulating the topics and issues with government and their downfall. Martinot exposes the questionable acts of the U.S. engaging Afghanistan, a military policy predicated on the absence of evidence signified that mainstream support for the revenge assault required no evidence. Neither the restraint called for by the anti-war opposition nor the horror of subjecting Afghanistan to the mass destruction had any moderating effect, to the extent that a government proclamation was sufficient to marshal support. The phenomenon is cultural rather than political. To continue with the cultivation of the newfound knowledge we have, we can start to paint a picture of the downfall of the U.S. and interventionism. There are now 2,000 pages of previously unknown and unpublished notes from interviews from people with direct relations to the war, such as generals, diplomats, and Afghan officials. Bob Crowley, an Army colonel who served as a senior counterinsurgency advisor to the U.S. military commanders in 2013 to 14, stated every data point was altered to present the best picture possible, as well as surveys, for instance, were totally unreliable but reinforced that everything we were doing was right, and we became a self-flicking ice cream cone. Nita Crawford is a professor of political science at Boston University and co-director of the Costs of War Project. Crawford's article argues with stats taken during the war. Over the past nearly 15 years, approximately 111,000 people have been killed and more than 116,000 have been injured in the war in Afghanistan. Among these people, 31,000 were of dead Afghan civilians. Even this number is expected to be larger due to the long periods of time where civilian deaths were not recorded. After the most violent stages of the war, reports were made on civilians' death by explosive remnants of war. In 2014, 124 civilians died due to ERW. That number tripled just a year later. Douglas Lute, a three-star Army general who served as the White House's Afghan war czar, during the Bush and Obama administrations mentioned, we were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing. During many of the interviews, officials presumed the remark would remain secret and not available to the public. Fortunately for the public, we have most of the records of the interviewees. A majority of the interviewed acknowledged that their warfighting strategies were flawed and that Washington had wasted an enormous amount of money trying to make Afghanistan a modern nation. The United States government failed to halt runaway corruption, built a competent Afghan army/police force, and put a stop to the thriving opium trade present in Afghanistan. Anita Crawford, mentioned above, had an inflation-adjusted estimate of how much was spent towards Afghanistan. It was appropriated between $934 and $978 billion. Quoted by the Washington Post, James Dobbins, former senior U.S. diplomat who served as a special envoy to Afghanistan under Bush and Obama, said, "We don't invade authoritarian countries to make them democratic. We invade violent countries to make them peaceful, and we clearly failed in Afghanistan."
With every war that the United States joins, there are always a handful of reasons why they never should have intervened. Only on rare occasions, such as during World War II, is there a greater percentage of Americans who think intervention is a good idea. But even then, there have been a fair amount of people who thought it was a mistake. The majority of time, war does not bring enough good to the country to make intervention a reasonable idea.